The Chinese Dadao is a very recognizable blade. It is often seen as a symbol of China's resistance against the Japanese invasions of the 20th century. But the history of this big sword and its design reaches much further back when it carried a much different and darker meaning. So let's take a closer look at this blade by L.K. Chen and the history of the Dadao. The L.K. Chen Dadao is 90 centimeters long overall, with 60 centimeters of high-carbon manganese spring steel blade and a handle length of 22.5 centimeters, which consists of 2 wooden scales wrapped with red cotton. The ring pommel is quite large with a diameter of 7.5 centimeters and has a red tassel tied on similar to what many soldiers had on their blades in the mid-20th century. This particular version is a very common design for the Dadao, but it is not the only standard version, as there's quite a variety of blades that fall under the same name. In fact, when we look back at pictures, illustrations, videos, and even existing antiques from the last century, we can see a wide range and variety of blade lengths, shapes, guard shapes, handle shapes, all of these which again fall under the same name of Dadao. From the fall of the Qing dynasty to political uprisings, the warlord era, and the Sino-Japan wars, the 20th century was brutal and China was overstretched on resources and manpower. And this was all before World War II. To defend the country, China had to arm as many people as possible. And the production and manufacturing of firearms takes a lot of time and precision machinery. On the other hand, swords could be quickly produced by experienced bladesmiths as well as local blacksmiths. So with a couple of general requirements in the sword's construction and design, there was a lot of room for variation. Now, I actually happen to have an antique Dadao. This was given to me by my first Tai Chi instructor, Bill Regan, and he picked it up at auction. And unfortunately, there was fairly little information about this blade. So if anything stands out to you, definitely chime in the comments. Maybe there's somewhere that I can pursue for further research on the origins of this particular sword. The blade is 53 centimeters long, the handle is 21 centimeters long, and it weighs just over 1 kilo. Even beyond these aspects, the sword is not as thick overall and even has much more distal taper towards the tip than the L.K. Chen sword, making it all around lighter. Now you can really see when these two are side by side, the L.K. Chen sword is a lot more robust than the antique. And yet even at 120 grams heavier, this sword feels a lot more agile and lively in the hand. On the antique sword, there are etchings on both sides of the blade which read, "Eliminate violence, restore peace." And this was a motto that first was seen back in the Song Dynasty, but was later revived in the Qing Dynasty novel, The 7 Heroes and 5 Gallants, which promoted justice, righteousness, and honor. This was the sentiment of the time, to drive out the invading Japanese forces and restore peace to China. This sword became a symbol of that resistance, and because of such prestige, it had to have a design that was specifically Chinese. The shape was inspired by the blades of the Ming and Song dynasties, from the swords of the heroes in the storybooks, like the 108 stars of Liangshan, deities like Erlang and the generals of the 3 kingdoms, to even real-life heroes like Yue Fei and Qi Jiguang. The blade was big, like a cleaver, curved, clipped, and had a ring pommel, a very distinctly Chinese design, and was a complete contrast to the Japanese gunto and katana, or even Western sabers of the time. However, it also had to be usable by anyone, including the untrained. So a two-handed grip was implemented for better control and leverage. The blade was made thicker to handle abuse, and the weight added into the cut. So as long as they could swing, it could cut. Now, don't get me wrong, just because this sword was made to be able to be usable by the unskilled and untrained, it doesn't make it any less of a sword. In fact, I would say that this sword scales up with the user's ability and can be very effective when wielded by a very skilled practitioner. Especially this LK Chen sword. It has an excellent mass distribution that, when coupled with the handle length, has a natural acceleration that delivers powerful and more authoritative cuts. It handles well with Choi Li Fut techniques, as well as the Dadao manual techniques from the 1930s. So I can confidently say that this sword is an excellent sword for martial artists. Although the Dadao is most widely known for its involvement in World War II, the design was nothing new, and the history of the sword goes back much further, although at that time it was a symbol much less patriotic. These swords were often carried as a tool of law enforcement and on-the-spot punishment for crimes. It is said that on average, 3 to 4 different types of law enforcement could be found patrolling the streets of any major Chinese city, including a local police force that was adopted and modeled after the Western police officers and bureaus, plainclothes detectives that operated separate from the police force and were most commonly tied to gangs and criminal groups, and even a military police force to patrol and maintain public order. These patrols were described as small mobile units of 4 to 6 people, usually consisting of a commanding officer, a couple to apprehend and chase down criminals, as well as an executioner. Now, criminals were often tried on the spot and received judgment, usually in the form of beheading. Such public executions were a way to control the population through terror. This symbol of fear and control was then adopted by bandits and warlord armies as they campaigned against the ruling government, rival factions, and the people of the overtaken territories. It wasn't until the Japanese invasion and the Sino-Japanese wars that the effectiveness and utility of this sword turned its image around from that of corruption to one of protecting the people. Big sword teams were created and deployed by the military and are the most well-known of the Dadao wielders. But the sword was also carried by other military and paramilitary groups and even railway guards. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and even into World War II, techniques for the Dadao were developed specifically to combat a particular weapon, the Japanese bayonet. We often think of bayonets being used only at the end of assaults when ammunition was running low. However, that is not completely the case. Japan had earned notoriety for their aggressive head-on tactics during the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s. One of these tactics was the bayonet charge, also called the banzai charge, which was a full-force charge into enemy fire to overwhelm and overtake the Russians with return fire and, of course, bayonets. At this point in history, most armies had bolt-action rifles, which allowed timing gaps between shots. And although many Japanese would fall at the front of the charge, they were still able to swarm and overwhelm Russians' forces, and leading to victory after victory. The tactic paid off and even earned Japan international attention. Even into World War II, the Japanese saw success in China with the banzai charge, as Chinese soldiers were typically equipped with older, more rudimentary firearms. By this time, the Japanese had developed and honed their bayonet fighting skills, making them even more efficient. Anti-bayonet techniques were vital for Chinese forces, and military generals as well as martial artists stepped up to develop techniques, routines, and drills for the Dadao. You can even find Dadao sets in martial arts like Choi Li Fut, Mantis, and Bak Mei. There were some very heroic battles fought by the Chinese against all odds with nothing but Dadao in hand. So it's no wonder that this sword became a symbol of national pride and resistance to the invaders. However, the actual amount of Dadao victories is not as compelling as we'd like to believe. It is my opinion, so take it as you will, that beyond the already stacked up odds against the Chinese, with equipment, firearms, and training even, the Japanese were already years ahead in terms of battle preparedness, training and techniques, and combat testing their close quarters combat skills. In the preface of the 1931 Dadao manual written by Yin Yuzhang, he states that the Japanese military actually came over to China and hired saber instructors and then transported them back to Japan to teach the Dadao techniques and tactics to the Japanese military. Now, if this is true, this would have given the Japanese even more of an edge, so to speak, when it came to preparing for clashes against the Chinese. Beyond that, the Japanese had already been training their bayonet fighting against sword. Skilled kendo practitioners were often paired up to train soldiers, and even the sport of Jukendo, or bayonet fighting, was created. If you want to see how fast a bayonet exchange would be, just look up Jukendo, which is still practiced in Japan today. You can easily see how incredibly difficult it would be to respond to a split-second thrust, let alone counter it. Again, even against the odds, the Dadao did have its shining moments, and these moments were enough to invoke the national pride and motivation to continue to fight, even to the last cut. These stories have been immortalized through movies, television, books, and more over the years, and that is why this sword has become so distinctly recognizable. I personally think that this is an excellent sword design. It has a natural pull into the cut and becomes very effective with minimal training. The best part is that the sword will scale up with the skill and abilities of the user. So the more that you can do with it as a martial artist, the more refined your skills are, the more effective this sword is going to be. I have found this to be true many times over, whether it has been through forms training or cutting practice, where this sword really shines. Had it been forged in an earlier period in history, this sword may have dominated on the battlefield against swords and spears, but instead it found itself pitted against bullets and bayonets. If you were interested in picking up this sword for yourself, I'll leave a link to its listing on LK Chen's website in the description below. And if you want to know more about the history of the Dadao, I highly suggest you head on over to ChineseMartialStudies.com. I got a lot of my information for this video from their site, and I barely scratched the surface. So if you want to check out more about that, I will leave links and references in the description down below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching this video and taking a look into the many sides of the Chinese Dadao. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.